I was asked the question you were just asked. My personal one would be that the path to citizenship is non-negotiable, but I've heard a lot of various groups, dreamer groups, ethnic bar associations, community organizations, saying that's not true, and from their point of view that is negotiable and all people care about is getting a green card, and that the path to citizenship is not you know, the golden ring the way some others in the community might think it is, and I just wondered if you would address that for a minute.
Well, are you saying most people say, I just want legal status so that I don't have to worry about being deported?
I'm saying that I hear many people say that's all I really need.
True. No one says they have to go through the whole process. But I mean, I think in terms of strategy and in terms of the best public policy, you want to get people who want to be citizens because of the benefits of citizenship. So if you fall short of that, you're creating an underclass of people that don't have the same rights as others. I mean, this is what I would say to those people. Now, I don't think they have to go through the whole program necessarily. I think there wasn't a provision that, so why fall short? Why, you know? And I would also get them in the room and say, don't say that. You know, let's stick to the message. You know, you might leave that, you'll get that, but let's stick to the message for those people that do want to be citizens. And don't we want to accept citizens who are willing to go through that? You know, they'll be good Americans on this side.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you also say, why would Republicans have any interest in any reform? The Democrats are likely to be very vulnerable in 2018. Mm-hmm. Most members of the House get reelected, regardless of what they do. And the blame for that will sort of fall more on the executive branch than it will on individual members of Congress. We've got 40% of the people ready to vote for Donald Trump, who's no more qualified than Donald Duck to run for president. I think that this deep nativism referred to is really going to be still highly mobilized after the election. You've got a vast communications media promoting it all.
Sure.
I think those are fair points, and the question really, I think for the, you know, at the heart of the debates within the Republican Party is, you know, what is the future of our party? Right, and so if the Republican, you know, the Republican Party famously did the so-called autopsy after the 2012 election, where they did not fare well with Latino voters and Asian American voters, and you know, laid out a prescription for, you know, rebuilding relationships with those communities, and it didn't, you know, within 6 months, that lesson seemed to have been lost. But you know, depending on the outcome of this election, you might see a similar pattern, and so then I think it comes down to again, sort of, you know, the leadership of the party and how it wants to interact with its members. And if the numbers are such that, as Speaker Ryan thinks there is long-term benefit in working across the aisle and passing a bill that might take, you know, there might be initial blowback but maybe it fades over time, and maybe he thinks the path to building out a strong Republican Party that's much more diverse for the future is worth it, right? So that's his call, right? And Kevin mentioned the so-called pastorate rule. They, for a while now, speakers of the House have, in most cases, only brought bills to the floor for a vote if a majority of the majority supports it, right? That's the pastorate rule. John Boehner broke it a few times when he felt he needed to for political reasons, and you know, the pastorate rule is only a practice; it's not actually a rule. So, you know, maybe people can convince Paul Ryan that there's long-term benefit in bringing up a bill for a simple up or down vote rather than applying that standard.
And I would just add simply, the Republicans want to win the White House again. And the Speaker of the House probably wants to be the one to win it. And watch Ted Cruz. He'll be a player on this too. Bishop Martin?
Yeah. One thing I think is easy to compromise on, which is really the work verification. This is why legalization failed the last time. They weren't serious about it. First, the business community wasn't serious about it. They didn't want it. But now with a biometric piece to it, then you don't need a wall, because people are here to work. And if they can't work, they won't come. And I don't think anybody could be against that. It's something that can be conceded. We're ready to be able to do it. We couldn't do it in the past. Now you can do it. I think that's a piece that all advocates have to be able to put in, because this is where the American people are angry. You hear with that anger, and you have to deal with it, because they feel somehow that their jobs are being taken away from them, which isn't quite the truth. We know the jobs have been outsourced. Globalization is here to stay. We cannot, become a manufacturing country again as we were in the past. But where do people go? They have to work, but they at least have to be convinced that the jobs are not taken by undocumented people.
Jamie?
Hi, so this is a really interesting panel, and I kind of want to pick up on this last point. Because when we think about the sort of the hard right response to immigration, it's not just a measure of sort of the depth of feeling about immigration. It's kind of what immigration has been made to proxy for, and I think that's an important distinction. Because if Clinton wins, we can't just write off Trump supporters. Part of the sort of policy push is also sort of changing the narrative about what immigration means and what it does. And right now, sort of in public discourse, that has been set by Trump, right? And so part of what we have to do is change the dominant narrative about immigration. I think that's where Anne's point about, and Kevin's point about the need to work across all these scales is really important, that we have to have local immigrant rights groups and state level immigrant rights groups and national level, all part of this process of changing what immigration is allowed to proxy for. Because a lot of the Trump supporters are using a language of immigration to complain about things like neoliberal globalization and outsourcing, and it's really hard to say my life is really crappy right now because of this thing called neoliberalism, where it's very easy to say my life is awful because of immigrants. And part of what we have to do is figure out how to change that narrative.
Can I jump in on one point though? I do think there is an element here that is rooted in people's feelings about those who, the so-called, the lawbreakers who cross the border without permission, right? So I saw Mark Krikorian, a very prominent critic of immigration reform, speak once, and he spoke about the people in his constituency very openly and said, we feel that the people who entered the country without permission have trampled on our flag and disrespected our sovereignty, and we won't support them gaining legal status unless there's some way to cure that violation, right? And it felt like almost like a purifying process had to be completed, and I reflected on it because if you think about the various bills we've seen, there's always some mechanism in those bills that it tries to satisfy that desire for repentance, if you will, right? So in the 2006 bill, we had a touchback provision that before people could come into the regularization process, they had to leave the U.S., touch foreign soil, and re-enter lawfully, right? And so that was one way that you could address this deep-seated feeling of disrespecting the sovereignty of the nation. And the different bills have all had various ways of dealing with this. I don't know what the solution is, what is the magic formula that gets at that that deep-seated feeling, but I do think advocates are work at their peril if they don't remember that is a feeling, a genuine feeling people have, whether one agrees with it or not.
Going forward, what are the prospects for the U.S. to accept more refugees from Syria?
Well, I think in the current fiscal year, which just began, the overall number is expected to be 110,000 total refugees coming in from overseas through the formal resettlement process. I think there's a rough calculation of about 10,000 Syrians again. Normally we don't break it down by nation. There are regional, they're not quotas, but sort of target numbers for different regions. So that the 10,000 Syrian refugee slots was a little bit of an unusual situation because the need was, and the, you know, to a certain degree, public support for bringing in Syrians was so high. I think that there's every reason to believe that at this moment that if Secretary Clinton wins, that she'll continue the Obama administration's plans and probably bring in roughly that number. I think in the end about 12,000 Syrians were admitted last year out of 85,000 that were admitted through the formal resettlement program.
And you're first and then Susan second.
Oh, thanks. Paul Feldman with West Global Talent Bridge. I want to ask about this issue of, the two of you are up here looking from the state perspective and national perspective in particular. We work with immigrants in the country and we work along around issues of talent integration and the economic benefit that immigrants bring to communities. And it shows up in interesting places that are not always in our minds identified with pro-immigrant and immigration agendas and attitudes. And I wonder, because of that, and we just had a conference where communities from around the country, from Louisville to Nashville to Pittsburgh to Detroit, and many others, Lincoln, Nebraska, were looking at this issue from the local perspective and seeing the imperative to utilize and take advantage of immigrant talent. Where is the interplay between that influence in local state legislatures, potentially, and on the national dialogue of the immigrant agenda in the local states versus the immigration process? Is there opportunity for that issue to have resonance because this is bubbling up from individual communities and states?
What I often say is the follow the money rule, and so where states are looking at people with talent who are legally here and not working at their capacity, this is an easy win. So places like California, Nebraska, Florida, Michigan through executive action, I'm missing a state, but they have all done some things in the past year or two to expand opportunities for these talented individuals to get state licensing so that they can pay the fees and also contribute to the economy. And I think that's an area to grow, but I have not yet seen it turn to the national level for improved licensing level, but licensing is a state role. I think it behooves us to capitalize. If you can move somebody from a certain level of employment and salary and say, if you do this a little bit more, you suddenly get a person earning much more, which is going to be spent in taxes and consumption. That's better for a state economy.
I guess I'd just say we've seen different parts of the country where local business leaders have banded together to study their local economy and have found that growth is seen in immigrant-dominated industries and neighborhoods, right? And it's high skill, lower skill across the board. St. Louis is the best example of this. There's I think it's called the Mosaic Group, they have a 3-inch thick, economic analysis that they carry around with them, but their basic talking points are, our economic trajectory is a flat line except in immigrant industries and neighborhoods, and so it's from the, resettled Bosnian refugees revitalizing, blighted neighborhoods to health, hospitality, medicine, science, everything. So I think those are probably the best advocates that can go to Congress because they're local people talking to their elected officials and saying, we represent this business community in your state, in your district, and this is what we see and this is what we need. That, no offense to the Washington advocates, but I think those are among the most effective lobbyists, if you will, that could be advocating for these reforms.
Yeah, Kevin, I want to press you a little bit more and also get Tara and Anne's perspective on this. Twice towards the beginning and then came back to the end, you mentioned maybe a smaller package. I've recommended for a long time that we try for incremental reform that in a way comprehensive over the last decade has been, going for the perfect has been, we haven't gotten any of the good on that. So, but what would that package look like? Is it just the DREAM Act, jobs, and e-verifying, which seems to be the three things that keep coming up as having large bipartisan, larger bipartisan support. There another package, and maybe for Tara and Ann, Tara, how politically feasible would it be to go for a smaller package? I think in 2006 they could have passed them. Wondering whether they would at this point, and whether that would satisfy the states. If we had, a smaller legalization, yes, to some increased enforcement, but not the entire package.
Well, I mean, the discussion on the Hill in the past when this has come up has been an ag jobs dream and some sort of enforcement piece. I mean, ideally, I would like to see a legalization program and maybe an E-Verify, but that's what you did in '86, and it didn't work. So I don't know if that would fly, but maybe you add an entry-exit or something. Maybe that's giving up too much. I don't know. But when I say a smaller package, I in my mind, it doesn't include every element that I went through: future flows, the legal immigration changes. Something you bring people out of the shadows. You do something in the workplace. You have the votes for that. And what's happened in the past, unfortunately, is that there's been so many vested interests on all these different pieces that you can't get to that because everyone pulls off and says no, and it gets people to oppose it. So I don't know if it's politically feasible.
I guess for me, I think it just hinges on the question of trust. Because if you have, you might be able to get that package, but if all the other constituencies don't believe there will be a second package coming down the pike, then they might not, they might rally against the first package, or they might insist on their issues being added. And so I think that's really the trick. There were talks in the last few years about trying to set up a series of small packages, and so the trick was to figure out what each package would be, and then get people to believe that 1 would lead to 2, would lead to 3, would lead to 4. Because I think that for the folks that are the most focused on legalization, the Ag Jobs, DREAM Act, and E-Verify package is not going to be satisfying in any way, shape, or form, right? Oh, wait, Dan.
Yeah, my boss would say this is above my pay grade, but I'm going to venture an opinion anyway. We did just reaffirm NCSL's policy, which requires all 4 things, and I am agreeable with Tara. I think there's an argument about incrementalism, that if we just we do something and we'll see how that works, but that will get us back to enforcement only. And I think our members want enforcement plus jobs, plus legalization, plus impact assistance. And that if you do one thing that fails, you're worse off than you were before. So my hope is that we would figure out a way to separate out the pieces, let it go through different House committees, and then wrap it together and see if people can have a vote on it. And, always the optimist.
Don.
Yeah, look, I wanted to pick up Bob's idea, the rolling registry idea, and is there any, it's gotten no attention, but what do we have, Bob? 2 million people in the US who have been here for more than 20 years, and whatever the number is on 15 years. It gets ridiculous after a point. Do they really have to wait to be here for 40, whatever the time, I guess it's 72 now. Is there any kind of, or would there be any support for recognizing that people who have been here forever and are not going home and have family and jobs and good moral character ought to be able to legalize their status without being penalized in some way or punished?
Yeah, I think if you put it at 20 years, you have the advocates screaming, that's not good enough. I think if you put it at 10 years though, what is that, 70% of the people?
Almost.
Yeah, and you didn't have all these barriers built in, it just happened. I think that would be.
I guess I just don't know what the reaction would be, because it wasn't part of these other packages. And so we don't really have a sense of if it would be fought against tooth and nail, or if it might somehow slip through. I just don't know.
The mindset is, as I said, is counterintuitive. They want to legalize people and make it as hard as possible for them to achieve it. So if you just did a rolling registry, I think they would think, oh, that's amnesty. Well, I think this will be the last question.
Okay, then I intend to ramble on then. That might be
Everyone
true.
give Bob their question.
Okay. I may have been traumatized by moving back to Indiana after living in DC for 35 years, but this is true. I hear all the time from various people, the biggest problem that everyone seems to have is the very idea of someone coming here illegally and then us putting them on a path to citizenship. That seems to be just such a, it won't fly as long as the House Republicans are in that position, okay? So what I've thought is different ways of getting to the same place. For example, I'll just run through a little scenario that we won't mention outside this room, but
Turn off the cameras.
let's say we did this. Those people who are waiting, who are on the backlog, we give them a green card. Okay, the backlog's gone. Now we say, if you've been here since for 1, 2, 3 years, however many, we will make you a temporary immigrant, or whatever kind of phrase you want to use for that. And they would be allowed then to apply for a green card, like a 245I kind of situation. So they could, but we don't make them on a path to citizenship. We just say, you can apply in your country for a visa. And at the same time, we make more immigrant visas available so that can happen. Possibly even, Ellen Crayley and I had a suggestion 35 years ago that when immigrants move out of the country, we should reuse the visa. And that was about 30 years ago. 250 to 300,000 immigrants leave the U.S. every year. If we had put that into effect all that time ago, we would have 6 million visas. We wouldn't have a backlog. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we need to think about these things constructively that way, because if it's true that as long as it's a direct path to citizenship, even if it's 13 years, it'll be voted down.
But isn't part of the problem that we've created a vernacular where it sounds like, you know, people who go through a process to regularize their status and eventually get a green card are on some kind of special path to citizenship. Whereas if, once they have a green card, they're like any other green card holder, that's not a special path, right? So I think maybe this is the fault of the, you know, of people not being careful enough with language. But I think that, you know, that's one thing. I think, to your point about,
that's why I wanted to get rid of the backlog first, so that they're not getting in front of anybody else. And I think the way these things are presented to the public is really important.
I think one thing we could try to do is, sorry Kevin, is, you know, there are members of Congress who will support, you know, tinkering with visa numbers as long as the overall number doesn't increase. And that might be with green cards, that might be with U visas for crime victims, that might be with H-1Bs. And so it does put policymakers into the position of sort of going through all these contortionist gymnastics to say, well, for X number of years we had 10,000 U visas authorized, but none were issued, so let's go back and recapture those. I mean, it's sort of fuzzy math, but I think if people could break out of that zero-sum game mentality, then yeah, you could do things like you just described. You could create new avenues, you could create new channels, and you wouldn't be boxed in that way. Sorry, Kevin.
No, I agree. I mean, maybe the path to citizenship paradigm needs to change because it's so well known now, and they can manipulate it in such a way that it looks like something good that it's not.
Right.
Yeah, you might. I mean, Bob, you're magical at numbers. Could you take a certain number of people and say, if I did it my way, I'd have more people get green cards before someone in a path to citizenship? I mean, can you enumerate that?
It depends on the backlogs. As long as you've got huge backlogs, you've got a problem.
Yeah. Great. Any last words? Okay. That concludes our conference. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at the gala.